So there's lots of talk around these internet parts about costumes in films and, inevitably, everything that they get wrong, and I'm beginning to get the sense that we are giving the false impression that any attempt at period costume ever is by default deeply flawed in terms of accuracy, which is definitely not the case. There are definitely some seriously well done costumes in films and TV shows out there, and we're about to give those friends some love today. This list, by the way, is by no means comprehensive, but merely a personal selection of things that I have seen and have been very impressed by. Contrary to what a lot of the internet may have you believe, a lot of period costume in film and TV is actually, if sometimes a bit imperfect, generally passable, which is why I still maintain that I have no plans to do individual costume reviews, no matter how many people insist that I review and with an E. Here's my review. The costumes are fine. This is also not to say that there aren't accuracy flaws in some of the pieces we are about to discuss. Once again, I will give the usual disclaimer that there is no such thing as historical accuracy, that due to the passing of time, inevitably some crucial bits of information have slipped through the cracks and prevent us from achieving true 100% recreations of actual history. The difference between these, then, and some of the less sartorially successful films we've explored previously is that there is a very clear and palpable sense that there was actual research done, that real historical garments were consulted, that serious attention was paid to silhouette and proportion and fit. There are details in these clothes so fine, such as hand finishing, thread-worked buttons, weird trimming techniques that are so nuanced and specific to the period, it's very clear that the designers knew in incredible detail what source material they were drawing from in order to effectively tell a story that serves both the plot, character, as well as the historical setting, which, surprisingly, is extremely crucial to the world building of a period film. This video is also very kindly brought to you by our friends at Acorn TV, which I shall tell you more about at the end of this video. First and foremost, number one in all of my books is Gentleman Jack. Did I write this entire video solely as an excuse to rave about Gentleman Jack for approximately 5 minutes? Irrelevant. Let us take a moment to behold. Thread-worked buttons, stays, real, actual, proper 1830s corded stays with a busk, hand-sewn eyelet holes. Friends, this is only the opening sequence. Buckle up for the rest of the show. So, Gentleman Jack is a biographical story of Anne Lister and is based off of events recorded in her actual journal, which means we have the very specific dates of 1832 to 33 in which the story of season 1 takes place. There are two, I believe, vague portraits of the real Anne Lister that we know of, and while designer Tom Pye made an extraordinary effort to reproduce elements of these on the fictional Anne Lister, down to the neck brooch, there are still elements that needed to be conjectured. For example, the heavy men's boots and the top hat that she wears in the series, both of which we can see were chosen to add distinct visual elements to her character, but not in that dissociative, modern, relatable aesthetic kind of way that a lot of period adaptations use to convey character to a modern audience. The crucial win in the interpretation of Anne Lister for screen here is the actual existence of all interpretations in actual history. So, for example, the decision to change her hairstyle from the more, what was in the 1830s, feminine side curl style on her original portraits to the historically more masculine horizontal buckles seen in the series, yes, is a deviation from the historical evidence that we have, but is a deviation from one verifiable historical style to another made intentionally to convey a crucial element of character while remaining securely within the realm of period believability. This is how interpretation for a modern audience is done, friends. Making changes from one questionable historical element to another preferable but equally historical element for the sake of character and storytelling, not for the sake of modern beauty aesthetic. Sign me way the heck up. Speaking of hairstyles, major props to this entire production team for embracing the weird, wild, wonderful insanity that was 1830s hairstyles. I feel like a lot of modern interpretations of the 1830s tend to shy away from this element with the excuse of unrelatability to modern audiences, but Gentleman Jack is prime evidence that this is not at all a valid excuse. Yes, they're weird, but within the context of the equally peculiar general fashion of the 1830s, which is also fully embraced, there's a very specific world built here. The contrast between Anne Lister's more subdued and masculine styles is heightened when juxtaposed with the more elaborate, everyday styles seen on some of the other women, and further contextualized when introduced to the high fashion version of supreme hairstyle ridiculousness as seen in the ball scenes. But here's the funny thing. Something extraordinary happens when one is exposed to a thing repeatedly for a period of time. Far from perpetually seeing it as alien and weird for the rest of eternity, most of us actually adopt adopt a familiar acceptance of said thing and learn to appreciate a little, if not a substantial bit of beauty in it. This is why I am so adamantly against this philosophy of needing to appeal to a modern beauty aesthetic. We're not even giving our audiences the chance to appreciate styles for what they were within their proper contexts. Anyway, still on the subject of hair, one of the things I appreciate the most about the hairstyling in this series is that, particularly on Anne Lister, the hair isn't perfectly perfect all of the time. Nothing weirdly bothers me more than watching those period dramas where the characters are running around outside on a windy moor doing something mildly exertive, all the while having perfectly sculpted hair. It just detracts from the feeling of reality, of human relatability to these people. So 10 out of 10 appreciation for the flyaways and falling bits and completely undoneness of some of the hairstyles here. Quick moment of appreciation for the literal drawn threadwork detail on Anne Lister's shirt here, but I also want to point out the attention given not only to the details of the specific period in which the story takes place, but the broader sense of logic put into the design of these clothes. That is, not everyone suddenly starts dressing like the latest fashion plate on January 1st of the new year. In fact, some styles remain sort of fossilized in their traditional nature. For example, the domestic staff in the households are very distinctly 18th century in silhouette. These costumes, within the context of the story, would have been considered uniforms, a particular set of garments that denoted a particular professional position, and would not have evolved as quickly as the latest fashions. This is a detail extremely specific to the general social practices surrounding human dress, not just the details of the dress itself in a vacuum. This shows that the designer is thinking not just of recreating historical replica clothing, but recreating the variety of dress within particular contexts to create this wonderful, realistically believable world in which, yeah, sometimes people wear things a little bit out of date. Sometimes on purpose, and sometimes just out of habit or necessity. This is further proven when we get to behold this dressing gown moment, which, if you look closely, literally looks as if she's wearing a repurposed robe a la française from the 18th century, with those wide ruffled cuffs, the ruffled robings down the front, and the pleated back detail. This is so historically accurate in practice, this repurposing of old gowns into new, more fashionable, or just household garments. This is the level of attention to detail I am here for. There's also, of course, the interpretation of fashionable silhouette between different classes. Again, we have the delicious application of the logic of practicality here that makes these foreign period clothes feel so human. Big sleeves were a thing in the 1830s. It was the way a lot of dresses were cut. But the difference between the upper class ladies sitting in their parlors with sleeves stuffed to high fashion ridiculousness and the more plain, practical, still large but unstuffed sleeves worn by the working class girls serves to create a unified world of here's how humans dressed back then. We don't get that boring, unrealistic, strict divide between upper and lower classes, where only the upper class ladies get anything remotely eccentric in their dress silhouettes. Because guess what? Lower class ladies could sew stuff too. But the distinction is made more on how these fashionable elements are adapted for the practical demands of what that character specifically regularly needed to do during her day. This is the basic element of contextual interpretation of historical dress that is often overlooked in period costume design. Oh, what's that? Could that be a zipper? No. They would not let us down like that. Dress hooks. Hand-sewn dress hooks. Fast forwarding a bit to 1849, the next film on my highly impressed list is Harriet, the recent, again, biographical story of Harriet Tubman. Once again, right from the very opening shot, we are given an incredible amount of minute historical detail in the clothes that immediately also tells us loads about the character and her situation. We see the mismatched buttons and the careful piecings at the shoulders, which immediately also establishes the historically accurate value not only of the fabric and the materials themselves, but of clothing as a whole. And the value of clothing is something that comes into play immensely later on in the film when part of Harriet's plan to help her family members escape is to literally bring them the clothing that visually represents higher value and thus will help them escape to freedom. Going back to the earlier point of fashionable silhouette and its adoption by various classes of people, we get to see this in play in the form of skirt shape throughout this film. It is only 1849 at the start of the story, and the steel wire crinoline wasn't patented until 1856, so we're the slightest bit too early for the widespread adoption of substantial skirt support in the beginning here. However, the crinoline was invented in response to the already growing trend of large skirts, which was previously done with layers and layers of heavily starched petticoats. These were extremely heavy and time-consuming to maintain, and these, or an even bulkier primitive crinoline structure, would not have been worn by anyone having to do much physical labor. Thus, we get to see a really interesting backstory of character as told by skirt shape here. Harriet and her family members, particularly in the earlier scenes, have very slim skirts, though still gathered or pleated at the waist according to standard dressmaking construction in this period. As Harriet escapes to freedom, she herself starts to adopt more skirt layers, this in the form of petticoats likely, as her skirts still don't seem to be quite as big as a structured underlayer would provide. Marie, on the other hand, who comes from more privileged circumstances and thus follows more closely to the dictates of higher fashion, does seem to have some significant understructure to help with what I believe is the largest skirt in the film. One thing I really appreciate in this film is the entirely realistic handling of underwear. Don't get me wrong, I love a good gratuitous historically accurate corset scene, but the general reality is that we don't tend to mention or even think about our underwear on a regular basis, and neither did people in history. It's just there, doing its job. You can tell that these actors are all underpinned as necessary. Those two darts on either side of the front of a gown was natural dressmaking construction at this time, and really just don't sit right unless you have the proper understructuring to fill that conical dress shape created by the darts. Harriet, or anyone really, is not tight-laced. That would be mind-numbingly impractical, and it's a good thing we understand that corsets and tight lacing exist as entirely separate entities, right? But this film is an excellent example of corsetry being used subtly and practically for the strictly functional purposes it served in history, rather than the aesthetic vanity oppression representations of today. Harriet walks from Maryland to Philadelphia without so much as mentioning her underpinnings, so I really don't ever want to hear any more moaning about the female oppressiveness of historical underwear from actresses, like, ever. Okay, controversial opinion time, but try as I might, I just do not like Jane Austen. Which is why it was such an extraordinary testament to the absolute brilliance of the Alexandra Byrne-led costume team that I actually managed to sit through the entirety of whatever the heck was Emma. But seriously, this film was so beautifully done in every aspect. The silhouettes of the characters were so on point, everyone literally looked as if they just stepped out of an 1815 fashion plate, and they still had the time and energy to put in so much cheeky detail. We have the miles of rouleau trimming, we have the white work embroidery, we have the clocked stockings and the ear cutout collar things, and the basting stitches, and yes, hand-sewn eyelet holes. But the one single detail that made me literally shriek was this one extremely unnecessary but extremely necessary moment where she pulls up her dress and shows us that no, she is not in fact wearing underwear, because split drawers were still not really a thing yet, and yes, believe it or not, before split drawers were a thing, you just didn't wear anything. This is something that no one ever addresses, so this moment literally brought me so much joy I cannot even begin to describe. Not to mention, of course, that the underwear that we did see was comprised of completely appropriate stays with, yes, proper 1815 shifts underneath. It's kind of sad how unreasonably excited we get about this, but then again, when we have been so consistently betrayed by shiftless corset wearing for so many long years, one must not be added for feeling such feels. Thank you very much. But back to silhouette, which obviously is so on point due to the intense attention to appropriate understructures. Personally, I was having a grand time playing Spot the Gowns, since many of the garments seen during this film are literal reproductions of actual surviving Regency gowns in museums. Yes, there is something to be said for costume design as an art form in and of itself, but there is also something to be said for the sheer and utter magical experience created when you get to see that gown you were drooling over one afternoon at the V&A on an actual body, moving, dancing, breathing, getting to see it come to life on a real, actual human being. This is time travel, basically. There is the one caveat that there were so many different outfits in this film. Pretty much everyone is in a different outfit practically in every scene, which isn't the most historically accurate thing, since we are still technically in the pre-sewing machine era and everything is still painstakingly stitched by hand, in theory, but this is a Jane Austen story, so presumably these people all have at least 10,000 a year or something, which means they can probably afford extravagant hordes of hand-embroidered gowns. Why not? In any case, it kept me watching the film, so I'm really not complaining. The only minor complaint I did have was with the obviousness of Emma's wig, which, though lovely, was was obvious and not in a historically accurate 18th century wig kind of way. The makeup, if present, is so subtle. Seriously, there is nothing more frustrating than a beautifully clothed period film featuring 2010's block eyebrows, obvious contouring, or unashamedly modern lip colors. In the menswear territory, we again see the progression of fashion reflected in the social class of each character. Posh blonde chap's coat is longer, with the flat collar and narrower lapels more attuned to the styles developing throughout the 19th century. Farm chap, on the other hand, has the shorter cutaway coat with the stand collar and wider lapels, more in fashion at the beginning of the Regency period. His coat is older in style since presumably he doesn't often go to have a brand new coat hand-tailored for him according to the latest fashion. Tulip Fever brings us to Amsterdam in 1634. And if you haven't heard of this film, I don't blame you. It is not a film I would have watched, let alone twice, if I hadn't heard such amazing things about the clothes. And indeed, on that front, it did not disappoint. Right from the start, we again are greeted with what in all appearances looks to be a beautifully hand-felled hem on that linen cap. And the theme of glorious fine-felled hems continues right the way through to the copious amounts of ruffs. It is my understanding that designer Michael O'Connor worked with lots of costume makers who originally worked in original practice at Shakespeare's Globe, so it is not the remotest surprise that especially in these small linen bits, the ruffs, caps, and cuffs specifically are really exquisitely done. But back to ruffs. They went really hard with the ruff game in this film, which is supremely appropriate considering the particularly Dutch early 17th century went extremely hard with ruffs. Wide ruffs, thick ruffs, ruffs folded into all sorts of intricate patterns, all of which were recreated impeccably in wondrous variety in the design. There is clearly incredible skill amongst the makers of the clothes here because it takes some seriously practiced rough work to recreate the fold pattern for something like this with only the help of portraiture. Also, it's a little vague here, but it really looks as if the folds of this ruff are held together with little straight pins, which is such a small intricacy of how these things actually worked that I'm pretty sure you have to have actually read Janet Arnold at least, if not delved into the murky depths of primary account records yourself in order to find this stuff out. So okay, you have won my trust. I'm always particularly biased towards 17th century things because especially early 17th century through Restoration are such underrepresented periods. Probably because, like the 1830s, it's a bit of a weird one to our modern eye. Far from the delicate floofy gowns of the Regency or the hourglass silhouettes in the later Victorian eras, the early 17th century sees, well, apart from the sheer in-your-faceness of ruffs in general, raised waistlines, extremely deep-set arms eyes, and just generally really large gowns. But we also get to see such glorious eye snacks as beautiful hand-worked lace, and I'm not going to lie, I definitely spent a substantial part of this film wondering where on earth the design team got so much gorgeous lace, because truly authentic looking lace is extremely difficult to find nowadays, and it takes ages to hand make. And inaccurate lace is one of the easiest things to just pull you straight out of the period altogether. Once again, there were a few numbers here that directly point to actual surviving extant garments, such as this pair of smooth covered stays in the Darmstadt Museum in Germany. Basically, again, everyone in this film looks as if they've literally just stepped out of a Franz Hals portrait, which is probably a good thing considering that portraiture is a central element of the plot. Number 5 on my list is a little bit cheating because it's technically not a film, but a filmed version of a play. And that is the 2012 production of Twelfth Night at Shakespeare's Globe. This is designed by dress historian / costume designer Jenny Tiramani back when the Globe was a sort of experimental archaeology project where they attempted to recreate Shakespeare's plays as they would have been done potentially during his lifetime, which I don't think they do anymore. But all of the clothes in this play are completely hand-sewn using late 16th century and early 17th century sewing methods, actual dress patterns and drafting techniques from the period, all natural fiber materials, to the point where the silk velvet for Olivia's gown was literally hand-woven. The ruffs were starched and set every night. Every detail down to the buttons had to be verifiably present in history on or before the year in which the play was originally staged. I couldn't not mention this one because if you're looking for historical representations, I'm of the belief that this is maybe, potentially, arguably, the closest thing to historical accuracy represented in post-period entertainment, like, ever. So as you may notice, all of the films and shows I selected for this video were produced within the last 8 years or so. This is not a coincidence. In fact, I think this hugely signifies the increasingly heightened public interest in period clothes, which means that there's more pressure on costume departments to get it right, and of course more attention is put into reproducing the actual history. Plus, it's getting increasingly difficult for films to get away with frustrating inaccuracies because audiences are getting smarter. I mean, look into the comment section of any YouTube video trying to spread misinformation on Victorian corsets nowadays. Or, Janet Arnold forbid, try to use the word corset to mean stays. Well done, friends. This brings me immense hope for the future. Audiences have the opportunity to actually learn stuff while watching period films and to develop their own unique appreciation for old styles, instead of just being continually gaslit into believing that there is only one true beauty aesthetic and that we are physically incapable of appreciating anything that we don't already see every day. No. Believe it or not, the demographic of people who watch period films tend to do so because we like to explore life in previous times. Shocker. Speaking of those of us who enjoy period and educational entertainment, this video has very kindly been brought to you by Acorn TV, an online app or TV-based streaming service that specializes in artful, sophisticated storytelling. For just $5.99 a month, you can get ad-free access to thousands of hours of binge-worthy content, including some more period drama classics such as Miss Fisher's Murder Mysteries, Poldark, Agatha Christie adaptations, and some amazing non-fictional historical dress-related content, including 1900 Island, where a group of contestants endeavor to recreate life in a 1900 fishing village, Savile Row, a 3-part mini-series on London's iconic tailoring district, and what I know is already a favorite amongst you lot, A Stitch in Time, the 6-episode mini-series that follows the original practice reconstruction of a selection of portraits throughout history. Acorn TV also highly recommend The Other One, a quirky British comedy following two sisters from completely different worlds who are entirely unaware that the other exists until their father drops dead. Downton Abbey stars might recognize Siobhan Finneran in this Acorn TV original, which has quickly made it to the top of my own watch list. If you are interested in having a browse, you can try Acorn TV free for 30 days by going to acorn.tv and using promo code Bernadette, or visiting the description box below. Happy watching! Anyway, thank you for joining me on what was admittedly just an excuse for me to fangirl extensively over old clothes under the guise of analysis, but honestly, that's just this entire channel. Are we quite finished?